How do you do, neighbor? It's Berean Spirits time once again. The boys have gathered around, and they're ready for you. So join in, make comments, and study with the guys as they try to study as the Bereans did in Acts chapter 17. And now, here's the guys.
Welcome back to another episode here of Berean Spirits. My name is Chris Peltz. I'm the evangelist with the Southside Church of Christ in Springfield, Missouri. And we have Richard Dodson with the Kearney Church of Christ in Kearney, Missouri. Richard, how are you today?
I'm good. It's a little damp up here today. It's raining.
Mm.
But everything's starting to green up, so.
Yeah, we're supposed to drop below freezing this weekend, so.
I know, but it can't last long.
No, yeah. I hope not. Certainly hope not. So, yeah, we got Josh Thornhill with the Brookmead Church of Christ over in Johnson City, Tennessee. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing all right. We are a bit chilly ourselves, and it looks like we are supposed to get a little bit of snow, maybe this coming weekend. Well, nope, it's done changed, so we're not this time. So
yeah.
But it did warm up. It was around freezing this morning, but it's about 47 now. So
yeah. We hit 60 yesterday, and it going to be highs in the low 30s, upper 20s this weekend. So yeah, it's that roller coaster time. What do they say about March? In like a lamb, out like a lion, or something like that, which is I think what's going to happen here anyway. So, but we had a lot of folks visiting this week. This week is the homeschool basketball tournament, which is held every year in Springfield, Missouri. And so we had a ton of visitors, both Sunday and last night, Wednesday night, and which was awesome. I always love that. It's always great meeting a lot of great folks. And
basketball families are great families.
Yeah. Man, I wish I'd have known. I'd have come and showed them how to play.
Yeah, that would have been helpful.
Or probably how not to play. That's probably what I would have done.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you would have waited till they turn their back and then throw them the ball.
You know how when you're actually watching basketball,
blind and then throw them the ball.
You're just never gonna forget that, are you? Well, you know how like they kick out the ball to a guy who's just absolutely wide open and he takes a big three and makes it. I'm the type that they'd want to leave me wide open, because I wouldn't make it anyway. So
yeah. Don't throw Josh the ball.
Yeah, because
that's what I've learned.
Score. I can't hit.
Those homeschoolers are pretty smart. I bet they'd figure that out. Probably within the first couple of minutes, probably after warm-ups. Let's not throw Josh the ball.
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. That was one time I was playing with some guys, and they wouldn't even cover me anymore, and they wouldn't even throw me the ball.
Oh, yeah. That's not even playing.
Well, they're like, wait a minute, he's on the bench.
No, I was actually on the floor, but they weren't.
Yeah.
I might as well have been on the bench.
How can you be that tall and not be able to play basketball?
Very carefully. I'd show you one day.
Yeah. All right. Well, guys, we want to talk about visitors. Speaking of the visitors we had this past week, and I want to talk about the church's approach and how we respond and how we treat those who visit with us. Because there are several things that I think are important for us to keep in mind and understand when it comes to our visitors. And it's imperative, I think, first and foremost, that we put forth some principles when it comes to our attitudes, not only towards God, obviously, I think, towards God, but towards the people that come into our assemblies, those that we have the opportunity to interact with, especially when it comes to those who are visiting with us when the church is gathered together. because that may be some of the only interaction that they have with Christians, and just exactly what true worship is all about. This may be one of the only opportunities that we have to not only interact with them, but to make a godly impression upon them, with the understanding, right? I mean, you meet someone out in public, they have no idea whether or not you are, claiming to be a Christian or not, unless you just are right up front with them on that. Your attitude, your approach to them, how you talk to them, is going to make an impression. But whether or not you're a Christian may not cross their mind. But if they're coming into your assembly, they're coming in probably with some preconceived ideas and notions. Not always, but sometimes they are. And so, how we approach them and how we talk to them is vital in making sure that we are demonstrating that we are God's children, that we are God's people. And it should be really no different in our assembly as in the public space in many instances. But sometimes, they're expecting something a little different. And the scriptures, I think, lay out a couple of passages when it comes to visitors. James chapter 2. In the first few verses of James chapter 2, there are a couple of people that come into the assembly, and there's an approach that some may have taken, and that he wants to correct the approach that they were having. In 1 Corinthians 14, there's an instance of some who are visiting in the assembly there with the church at Corinth. And so these give us some ideas, I think, of how we approach visitors in the assembly. And so, Richard, I want to start with you this morning and looking at and talking about this idea of, how we treat those who come into our assemblies.
Okay. What do you want me to say?
Oh, man.
You want me to,
Nothing.
you want me to just take the ball and run with it?
Yeah, I want you to take the ball and run with it.
Okay.
As fast as you can, but
Yeah. You want me to shoot and score? Unlike Josh.
we're not hoping for miracles here.
That's why he passed me the ball, Josh. Visitors are important for what you just said. We don't know what their intentions are when they come in. We don't know why they're coming. And there can be a wide variety of reasons. They could have a curiosity about, what we believe. They could be coming in because they're just passing through and they're looking for a place to worship. And they could be attending just because they're visiting family. That doesn't really matter, except for the fact I will say this. I think it's really important for every congregation to have a little pass out, something to pass out that gives them a little bit of an idea on what the beliefs are of the Christians that meet there, and an invitation for further study. I think that's very important to give to each and every visitor, because we don't know why they're coming. And if there is any questions about, why we're doing what we're doing, we want them to feel like we welcome, such examination and to encourage Bible study. And so I think those types of material are very important for every church to be passing out to their visitors. That has to be something that's ready to go. And I think many times people overlook that, but that's not something that we should be overlooking.
Sure, absolutely. But one of the things that it seems, especially in James chapter 2, when visitors had come into their assembly, there were those who were well put together, well dressed, right? Who appear as though they have some wealth and some money about them. And then there were those who would come in who seemed very poor and have no money. And the way that they treated them was completely different, right? said to those who were wealthy, come over here and sit, in this spot. And then to those who were poor, go over there and sit, or come and be my footstool. And so the way they treated people was completely different. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed, because I don't think it's any different today. I think that there is a difference sometimes when there shouldn't be, how we treat visitors based upon appearance. And that's an issue. That's a problem, and something that I think this is exactly what God is addressing right here in this particular text is, and just as he does in John chapter 7, verse 24, right? Judge not judge righteous judgment, but not according to appearances, but righteously. But it is one of those things where someone comes into our assembly, sometimes we begin to make assumptions, and that's where we get in trouble. Josh, when you think about those who come into the assembly, you start making assumptions about them. It's going to change how you treat them.
Right. And I think at that text there in James chapter 2, the more wealthy or the wealthier visitors are kind of honored, because it's kind of like, well, they have something to offer. And so we want to honor them so that maybe that some of that can come back to us. Whereas the other guy, this dirty, filthy guy, like, just sit him over in the corner. Like, he can't do anything for us, which obviously is the wrong attitude to have. And I think another way we could illustrate this concept is Luke chapter 7. At the very end of the chapter, you have Jesus going to eat with Simon, the Pharisee. And obviously Simon, being a Pharisee, it demonstrates a lot of the characteristics of the Pharisees, that self-righteousness. And they've exalted themselves to the point that they think they're an elite company. They're the righteous ones. They're the ones that almost, it seems, God's going to be just begging them to come into heaven. Like, come on, please, we need you here. And then this sinful woman comes in, and that's all we know about her. It says she was a sinner. And yet Jesus responds to these two people quite differently. He shows compassion for the woman and tells her that her sins are forgiven and sends her on her way in peace. But he rebukes Simon for his attitude. And I think, the point that Jesus is making here is both of them are just as much in need of Jesus as the other is. They both need Jesus. The woman recognized it, Simon didn't. And so, Jesus recognizes this woman who knows that she needs Jesus. She's willing to come to Jesus and falls at his feet in surrender. And that's the one Jesus has compassion on, versus this hardened heart that is not willing to, do the very same thing. And I think one of the things that we need to recognize, and I'm assuming, our focus here is not just that Christian family that's traveling that's going to, stop by and worship with us, but rather we're focused today on, non-Christians who come to visit in our assemblies. One of the things I think we need to recognize is we can go and knock on doors, and we can talk to people out in the community, and we obviously don't know what level of interest they have. And I'm not saying don't do those things. I'm just saying you don't know. I mean, you're approaching people who have varying degrees of interest. But the fact that somebody has entered into the assembly shows a degree of interest. And I think there's a prime opportunity there. It may turn into nothing. It may be an opportunity to save this soul. But there is an indication of some kind of interest there that, we can learn to, or we can try to lead to Christ. And then one other quick thing on those lines, I've heard the story about a preacher who was trying to get his mother to come to worship and trying to teach her the gospel. And he finally convinced her to come. And she had asked, would it be okay? Is it okay if I wear pants? And he said, yeah, that's fine. Don't worry about it. And she gets to the assembly, and a woman comes to her and gives her a stern lecture on how women should not wear pants in the assembly. And guess how many times she came back? Not once. And my point in giving that story is we need to recognize that we have an opportunity to save a soul. And we can do more damage than good sometimes if we're not careful. And the way I think we ought to look at this is, what's the greatest need? What is their greatest need? If you're drowning in the ocean, do you think the guy's going to, that on a rescue boat is going to come on and say, hey, you're late on your car payment? Well, if I don't get out of the water, you're not going to get a car payment, you know? I'm drowning. That's the pressing need right now. And so once I take care of that, then I can focus on the fact that I'm late on my car payment. Whereas when somebody is lost in sin, what they believe about premillennialism right now is irrelevant until we get them to the point of understanding salvation from sin and the redemption that Jesus provides. Until we get them to that point, I mean, it doesn't matter what they believe. They're lost anyway. And I think sometimes what we want to do is we want to correct people's understandings on all these other issues and leave them lost in sin when we've got it backwards. And I'm not saying don't address those issues. Those issues are important. But the most important thing is they need to be saved. And then we can work on the rest of that. But we need to keep the priority of, trying to save their soul.
Yeah. Ephesians 4 makes it very clear, with our speech, we are to give grace to the hearer. And that's to everyone, right? Everyone we have opportunity to teach. And when someone comes into our assembly, I think that the one of the things you pointed out, I think is absolutely needs to be stressed and understood, that they're demonstrating an interest, and motive, that's not for us to determine or to decide. The fact is they are there, which in and of itself demonstrates an interest in God and what we are doing. And we need to have that in mind. And that's first and foremost. And whether it's someone passing through, and I know your point. I understand what you're saying. There are those families that pass through that are going along. But even then, we can make a huge impression, because a lot of times we don't know if they are, recent converts, whether they've, are babes in Christ, or whether they're mature and, have a much better understanding than perhaps others. And the way we act and treat them even can have a huge impact on their future when they leave. And thinking about whether, I'll never go back, or I'll, can't wait to come back. Because even then, if they meet someone who's moving to our area, for example, they're like, where are they going to tell them to go if they had a good impression or a bad impression based upon how they were treated and how they were received by the saints at a certain location? Are they going to be able to say, yay, you know what? You are going to be welcome. You're going to experience saints who are genuinely interested in your soul. Or, it's like, let's try to find you somewhere else to go. That can literally be the impression that we leave if we're not careful. Richard, there's something that you have said to other congregations, and I'm trying to remember exactly how it was worded. Hopefully you'll know what I'm talking about, but it comes to evangelism in many ways, right? About who you reach out to and who you try to teach. And you're like, listen, if you go to the world's going to come, right? I mean, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. I said, if you invite the world to visit your services, don't be surprised if the world shows up.
Yeah.
But there has been many occasions when I've seen examples of what Josh is saying, where the world did show up at some service and people shunned them because, well, it's like I told some brethren one time, you need to go to a corner somewhere, anywhere in the town, go to a corner and just sit there and watch people. Because the way these people dress and look, that's who you're inviting to church. So you shouldn't be surprised if some guy comes in with his shirt sleeves tore off, and he's got big muscles with tattoos all over the place. And he looks like the leader of the pack, and he sits down right beside you. I mean, you got to make him feel welcome. That's your job. And there might be some things that he needs to work on with his appearance toward helping the cause of Christ, which I think appearance does. It's a manifestation of your attitude toward Christ, I believe. But there might be some work to do there. But there's some other things that's got to come first. He's got to learn. And so, like you said, he came for a reason. We don't know what that reason is, but maybe it is to learn. And so we got to give him a chance to grow and to learn. And if we just start shunning people because we don't like how they don't look like us, then to me that's just the same thing as what is being said in James chapter 2. I mean, it's not a rich man and poor man per se, but it's something else. And we got to be careful about that. We can show partiality in different forms.
Mm-hmm.
But, I've seen old acquaintances come to church, for instance, and then there'd be somebody come to church that nobody knew. Well, that old acquaintance, would have, maybe it's a past member, everybody would flock to them and talk to them and want to catch up with them, where the new person just got ignored. That's a way of showing partiality. And, the language issue is, if they don't speak your language, I know in some places this, it's not very prevalent in Kearney, but, in some places I've been at churches, especially down in Florida. I know it's this way in California where there are different languages. A lot of people speak Spanish. And, you still have to display brotherly love. You have to, even though you can't communicate with them, you can at least let them know that you're sure glad they're there, and you're going to try to communicate with them. So there's a lot of things that go into showing partiality that we really need to guard against. And one thing I do want to add, and I've seen this before too. A lot of times, members' purpose for going to church is not right. And it can hurt the church when your purpose for going to church is wrong. And I know some people go to church for the business contacts, and they like the networking. And so if they're a salesman or something, and there's someone who comes to church who's got money versus someone who comes to church who doesn't have money, well, if that's their reason for coming to church, they're obviously going to spend more time networking with the rich person than they will the poor person. And that can cause great harm. So, and I've seen that quite a bit. That is something that really needs to be spoken and guarded against. Brethren need to be reminded that church is not a place to conduct business, unless your business is the Lord's business. That has a time and a place. It's not at church.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've known doctors even who have had job opportunities in certain areas that were told at the I don't know what what the group that they are thinking about working with, as a physician, that they're like, listen, here we want you to go to this church or that church, and for that reason, right? Because that's where so many people are. They want them to network and be a part of a group, and there are some that couldn't take certain jobs because they weren't going to do that for that reason. They're going to find a local faithful church, and that's where they're going to go. They're not going to go to some mega group because that's what the the partnership wants them to do or requires of them. But yeah, absolutely, it happens.
Yeah.
To your point about don't be surprised when the world shows up. I think one of the things that makes some uncomfortable about evangelism is the fact that if done right, it is messy. And I think we have biblical evidence of that. And that would be the book of 1 Corinthians. You know, how many problems does Paul have to deal with in the book of 1 Corinthians? And we look at that, we might read that book and we might think, oh man, like what kind of, you know, worldly Christians is Paul dealing with? That's exactly what he's dealing with. He took the gospel to a highly immoral society, and the gospel is working within the hearts and lives of these people. And that doesn't mean you're going to snap your fingers and they're going to be the picture of Christ. It's going to take a process. It's called sanctification. It takes time. And they had made progress. And that's why in chapter 6 and verse 9, Paul says, the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God. And such were some of you. You know, sometimes when we invite people to worship and we have visitors coming in, sometimes that means we're going to have to deal with the alcoholic. Sometimes that means the sinful woman is going to enter the door. And the question is, are we going to respond to her like Simon did, where we look down our nose and, oh, who let her in? Or are we going to see a soul that needs saving and is in search of her Savior?
Yeah. And that's the one thing that we need to keep in mind at all times. And that is the fact that everyone is in need of salvation. And you know, Jesus makes that point when it comes to in Matthew chapter 19 with the rich young ruler, when he went away, you know, upset because of what Jesus had instructed him to do. And he talks about how difficult it is for the rich to enter the kingdom because, you know, they trust and rely oftentimes on their possessions rather than the Lord. And, you know, I think it was Richard who had mentioned earlier from James chapter 2, you know, we want to know what, or maybe it was you, Josh, I don't remember. But anyway, you know, what can they do for us rather than what can we do for them? You know, and which is completely the wrong attitude. It's the wrong attitude as a whole, as a member of a local church. While there are certain benefits and things that churches can do, and we should receive, you know, encouragement and teaching, edification, all those things from the others of that congregation, you know, our attitude should be less about what can I get and more about what can I give, what can I do, you know, in this situation and for those that I have opportunity to contact and to meet and encourage. You know, that's something that I need to be doing and have that attitude towards them. But and if you guys want to say something else on that, that's go ahead. But I do want to get into comfort zones, right? Because I think this has a lot to do with it as well. If you guys, again, you interrupt me real quick if you want to jump in on that. Otherwise, I'm going to move on.
I'll add one thing there.
Right.
You know, I heard a sermon a few years ago. A guy said that at one point he was preaching in a college town. And so obviously you're going to have Christians coming to this college and they're going to be visiting. You know, a lot of times he says you'd have, you know, guys come with their parents at the beginning of the semester and then you never see them again. But what he said he kind of started to see was that parents had been raising their children to go to a church to see what they had to offer rather than what they can do. And so the way I would describe that is, you know, we approach a congregation looking or with a bib on rather than with an apron. And it is our obligation as part of the Lord's body not to sit there with a bib and be fed. It's our job to serve. We're active members of the Lord's body, and we need to, you know, we have a role and we need to do our part within the kingdom of God. There's no room for spectators.
Well, if you ever seen me take the Lord's Supper, you'd think I need a bib.
Well, yeah, I mean,
I didn't know you ever took your bib off, Richard.
I tell you, I'm about the sloppiest eater. There have been a lot of times I've missed my mouth when I had the fruit of the vine and it went right on the shirt. I got a little bit in my mouth, but
that's shocking as big as it is.
Yeah, well,
his shirt or his mouth?
His mouth.
I've always kidded people. I've always said if I want to eat lunch again, I just chew on my shirt.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
always got food on it, but
That's not civilized, Richard.
he does make a good comment. I like that little point about the apron.
Absolutely.
There's been a lot of people who've left churches saying, "Oh, I don't get anything from that church."
What are you
Well,
giving?
what did you give? What did you do?
Yeah. You get out of it what you put into it, and
And
they're
that's
putting into it.
that's what visitors need to see. They need to see foot washers. They don't need to see somebody that's wanting somebody to wash their foot. They need to see foot washers attending there.
Yeah.
And by that, I'm making reference to Jesus washing the disciples' feet, being willing to serve others.
Yeah.
And that comes back to each congregation. Is it filled with people who want to serve, or do they want to be served? Like Josh said.
Yeah. There are some personalities that people have that are, there are the introverts, and there's the, you know, what's the other word?
Extrovert.
Extroverts. Yeah, right. Right. And, so there are those who are very outgoing and those who are very shy. And sometimes we use that as an excuse. And it's kind of like, when Peter got out of the boat in Matthew chapter 14 and Mark chapter 6, that's kind of where we're at. We need to get out of that comfort zone when it comes to our visitors and take some initiative. It may be the only opportunity we have to say hello to them. And we can't have the idea that, well, everyone else will, or somebody else will, because what'll end up happening is nobody else will. If that was the attitude of everyone, right? So let somebody else do it. It's not always comfortable. It can be something that is can cause anxiety, and I'm talking from experience here. As someone who can't see, and you have visitors that come in, that's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to try and find them. It's uncomfortable to walk up to someone not knowing if they're shaking a hand, if they've, if you hear them talking, I can generally tell which direction they're facing, but not always. If they're, turn to the right or left, if they walk away, and don't say anything, and I don't know they walked away, I'm standing there kind of left talking to myself sometimes. And so I can always come and tell you how uncomfortable of a situation I found myself in, and use that as an excuse not to try. But, God's going to look at that as, why aren't you trying? You didn't try. All right. It was uncomfortable, but think about all the times when you overcame that and the good that came out of it, whether you know about it or not, doesn't matter. This is what God expects you to do. And so stop making excuses or think that either someone else will do it or I'm just not comfortable, with that. And we have to get out of our comfort zone, and for the reasons we've already mentioned, right? People have expressed an interest merely by showing up. And, we need to take advantage of that.
To the point about the comfort zone, if you take a 5-pound weight and you start lifting that, eventually you're going to get to the point where it's not going to do much for you because you've grown beyond what that 5-pound weight can do for you. And that's what our comfort zones are. We don't grow within our comfort zone. We grow when we stretch our comfort zone, when we step out of our comfort zone. And I think that's as far as learning is concerned. Our comfort zone would be our knowledge, what we already know, what we're already comfortable with. But then we step out of that to learn new things, to expand what we know and our knowledge and our comfort zone. And that's how we grow as people. And I know there's probably extroverted people who are shy, and they're shy. There's very outgoing people who are introverted, but we can grow in that area. I know this might be a shock, but I used to be a really shy person. I know you might not realize that now, but I used to be, but I've kind of forced my way out of it to be a little more outgoing from a social standpoint. And it's possible to do if you're willing to work at it.
Yeah, Absolutely, absolutely. And also, tips for talking about, or talking to rather, visitors is, what is the one thing people like talking about the most usually?
Themselves.
Themselves. That's right. So when you go to interact with a visitor, all right, this is again one of those things where we can get into a trap of talking about us, about the church, and all about several things that have nothing to do with the visitor. And that can be a trap, because we want to share information with them, and not necessarily about us individually, but take an interest in them, right? They've taken an interest in us by showing up first and foremost. And so now it's our opportunity to take an interest in them and let them tell us about them, learn about them. And there's so much you can glean if you will let them talk, and give them that opportunity to go up and have a conversation with them and learn about them. While there are some who, want to keep very personal, don't want to share information. And sometimes, we've had some young ladies that have come and have visited with us, and they're very reserved and don't want to share a lot of info, which I get, in some instances, as far as safety, they don't know us. Understandable. But, but don't just go and dump information about anything and everything, but and not talk about them. Because that's one of the things I think that will attract them to the Lord, is to understand and know that we as God's children and God himself is interested in them and learning about them, so that we can grow together in Christ. Guys?
Well, I got a unrelated comment. It's going to switch gears a little. Is that okay?
Unless Josh wants to pick up on that some.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
And 1 Corinthians 14 that you talked about earlier, there's two things that I think it's important, and because it does mention visitors in verse 23. In verse 23, and this whole section is talking about, they were practicing spiritual gifts and speaking in tongues. And some of the people were speaking in tongues, but there was no interpreter. And so nobody knew the meaning of what they were saying. But he does say in verse 23, if therefore the whole church comes together and all speak in tongues, and outsiders or unbelievers enter, will they not say that you're out of your minds? Now, there's things in that chapter that I think that we need to take note of, so that our visitors won't see what we're doing and say that we're crazy or out of our minds. Mm-hmm. In verse 26, for instance, he says, let all things be done for building up, for edification. And then in verse 40, he says all things should be done decently and in order. And so these are the things that need to be taking place when we're at church. This is what the visitors need to see: a decent and orderly worship service where things are done for edification or the building up. And so what we're talking about doing things God's way and not man's way. And so, there are places where people can go visit churches where you will see things that man says and not God's. And I'll give you an example: handling snakes. I know it's very few, but I think some places, some of the mountain churches back east has some snake handlers that they do. And but there are a lot of churches that still practice speaking in tongues. I don't know about the interpreters that 1 Corinthians 14 talks about, but they do practice that.
The claim to, anyway.
Yeah, they have women speaking out in worship. And by speaking out, I'm talking about where they have the floor. People, their attention's on them. Faith healing. And there's a lot of things that I can put in this place where we're not seeing authorized worship, anything that's authorized. we're listening to man instead of listening to God. And if that's the case, then I think we're violating, uh, we're hurting our visitors, because they need to see those two things. They need to see things that are done for the building up, and they need to see it done decently and in order. And of
And
course,
that
there could be a big discussion about, what are those things that build up, and I'm willing to discuss that. But needless to say, that's what's authorized to do. This other stuff I mentioned, it's not.
and that's why I only run across the top of the pews when there's no visitors there. And we only have our snake handling
Whoa,
service
you
about
said
every
you,
6
you
months.
run across the top of the pews?
It's one of the most exciting services we have. Snake handling.
Oh,
Oh my
But
goodness.
only if there's no visitors. It's kind of sad when we have all this build up and then a visitor shows up, so we can't do the snake handling that week. So.
Yeah,
oh.
right. When you talk about the visitors, sometimes even as preachers, not just with visitors, but even sometimes with our own members, there's an expression that I heard it even before I became a Christian, but I've heard several old time preachers use it as well, and that is, put it where the calves can get it and the cows can get it too. And the idea is, especially in our preaching and in our teaching, don't try to don't do things with an attempt to make yourself look better or smarter or more educated, because those things are irrelevant. Those things don't matter. What matters is truth. And God gave us the gospel in simplicity, right? I mean, it is there to be understood. And sometimes we want to try and use these big words and make ourselves sound educated, and maybe there are those who are extremely educated, but they use terms and words in a way that it's almost as though they're trying to make sure others know that they're educated. And that can leave a sour taste. I mean, you can walk out of an assembly, much like in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, not that they were speaking in tongues, but they might as well have been with some of the words that they're using, and in the way that they talk. And you walk out like, I have no idea what that message was about. I have no idea what was being taught, because they're way over the head. They're talking in such a way that is just so out there and so up there that common folk just aren't going to get it. And that's a danger that we have, and I think we need to keep in mind. I mean, I know it's probably not an issue among us three anyway. No offense to myself or y'all, but there's a lot of words that can be used that can scare people away, because we use them for selfish reasons, not to truly express the truth and give grace to those who would hear.
I'm certain my erudite loquaciousness will be most advantageous, particularly as it regards intellectual discourse.
Oh man, I'm not certain of anything you just said.
I really don't think that's a problem with me.
Yeah, or me. Yeah, definitely. Definitely not me.
Yeah.
But it is one. I mean, I myself, right, after even preaching for several years, have visited congregations, and there have been some men who have stood up and presented lessons, and I'm shaking my head and like, I'm not sure what they were talking about. And just imagine what Josh just said, for 30 minutes going, talking like that. And, I don't know. I don't get it. I can't understand it. And if I can't understand that, then you're not going to reach me. And that's something that we need to understand, that there are different levels. And that's why I like that expression, put it where the calves can get it and the cows can get it too. If we present things at a certain level, then everyone will be able to understand it.
It's a calf, not a cow.
A calf, put it where a calf can get it. They're not as big. They're not as tall, right?
I understand that, but I still consider them a cow.
You have to draw them a picture, Chris.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do have a
Um,
closing comment. Oh, go ahead, Josh. I'm sorry.
I had to, when I was in West Tennessee, the congregation that I was worshiping with, there were a lot of folks that were, just simple country folk. They weren't highly educated. I guess they had high school education, but they weren't highly educated. I mean, they still had smarts in various areas, but they weren't, I guess you would say, deep thinkers. And I remember at one point, one of the things that I noticed about that group is their Bible studies were rather shallow in their discussion. It was good stuff, but it just wasn't very deep. And there were times where I was teaching classes and I was going a little deeper than what they were used to into the text, not using big words or anything, but I think I was going deeper into the text than what they were perhaps used to. And I remember it being like crickets, when, one of them would teach the class, there'd be like interaction all over the place. But when I would teach it and go a little deeper, it's like crickets. And I think in some ways I was a little over their heads in the way that I was digging into that text. And so I think there's lessons to be learned from that, as far as making sure that you know your audience and what they can handle, because it's easy to lose them if you're too deep or too intellectual in what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you definitely can, which is why it's good to let people talk and find out about them. They'll tell you about themselves. They'll tell you, and you can find out pretty quick where they are in all of those things. So, absolutely. Absolutely. Richard, you got some last thoughts?
Yeah, I do. I just want to quickly, I'll add this. In the book of First Corinthians, they were not unified. You see that in right off the start.
Mm-hmm.
And they had factions. And, that happens in churches. I understand that. There are times when church problems take place and they have to be addressed. But I want to say this, though. Those things need to be addressed outside the visitors. Those things have nothing to do with visitors. It's not their business. When we come together to worship, which is what they're coming for, I go back to verse 26 of 1 Corinthians 14. Let all things be done for building up. And then verse 40, all things should be done decently and in order. Dealing with church problems should be done outside the public assembly. I mean, that's something that the church needs to deal with themselves. That's not good for non-Christians to see and hear.
Yeah, that can definitely be an issue. Josh, last thoughts?
And I think along those lines, we do need to think about our reputation around the community as well. I know of a preacher who was moving to work with a congregation, and he was talking to the realtor, and she's like, "Are you sure you want to move here? They've had fistfights at that congregation over there." And that's the reputation these brethren have. And so, who's going to want to go visit there? Let's go to the fighting church over there. I agree with what Richard said, and there are times where I have wanted to make a very personal application to the group in one of my lessons, but I've held that back because we had visitors, and I didn't want to air our dirty laundry out for them to hear. And so I think being mindful of our visitors and the opportunity that we have is important, so that we can have the best opportunity we can to lead them to the truth.
Yeah. Folks, we are all people, right? Our visitors are people. We have the same common needs. And the most important of all of those needs is salvation, regardless of where you may fall on any spectrum that you want to talk about when it comes to, class, when it comes to social, places, when it comes to jobs, whatever it is. The one thing that we all share in common, besides the need for, food, shelter, clothing, is salvation. And we need to remember that. And the most important thing that we can offer is the gospel of Christ to all those who we have opportunity to talk to. And keep that in mind, regardless of where they're coming from, regardless of what they may look like, and regardless of their education. They have a need of salvation, and God is using us to present that to them, and take advantage of that opportunity that you have to save a soul. And so I hope everyone will take those things under consideration, some other thoughts that we've had during the program. We appreciate everybody who tunes in and listens. Be sure and share out the program. Hit that subscribe button. Give us a thumbs up as well. And until next time, remember to search the scriptures with Berean spirits.
Well, folks, that's all for today. Don't worry. Lord willing, the guys will be back next week for another Bible study on Berean spirits. Until then, let the guys hear from you. Drop them some email at bereanspirits@gmail.com. They'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep studying that Bible.